Hey there, wire weavers. Today we're kicking off the Ride the Wave bracelet make along. This is a simple and elegant bracelet that I designed in 2020. And as you may recall, that year was kind of a wild ride. My name is Wendy and I'm the wire weaver behind Door 44. If you want to learn to make wire jewelry, this channel's for you. The beauty of this bracelet is in its simplicity. It's made with a single piece of heavy gauge core wire. Today in part 1 of this make along series, we're going to sculpt our core wire into a simple and elegant hook and loop closure. Then in part 2 of this series, we'll weave the folded core wires together, and that's going to add a little bit of stability as well as some texture. Then we'll finish forming our bracelet into its final shape. Let's get started. Step 1. Download the free project starter guide. Bracelet sizing can be a bit tricky to figure out, so in addition to the usual list of tools, materials, and project specifications, I've included a discussion about bracelet sizing in the free project starter guide that goes along with this tutorial. I've even included a handy bracelet size chart that will help you achieve the perfect fit every time. To grab your free project starter guide, go to door44studios.com/106. That will take you to the project resources page for this tutorial. If you need help locating tools or materials for your Ride the Wave bracelet, you'll find clickable shopping links here. The free project starter guide is in my resource library. If you're a returning user and you already have a password, just click on Resource Library right here at the top of the page and type in your password. If you're new here, or if you forgot your password, click on Get a Password instead. Then complete and submit this form right here and you'll receive your password instantly. Step 2 is to choose your wire gauge. Now, I specified 14 gauge wire for this bracelet in the original tutorial, and 14 gauge does work beautifully for a women's bracelet, but I also made this bracelet here, and I made this for myself, so this is a small, it's a size 7 inches, but I used 12 gauge wire, and look at the difference here. Isn't that beautiful? The 12 gauge wire just feels so much more substantial and weighty and luxurious. It's really comfortable to wear, and because you have a little bit more material to work with, you can really kind of have fun sculpting and shaping your waves. So if you'd like to try 12 gauge or even 10 gauge wire for this bracelet, go ahead and give it a go. I think honestly, the heavier the gauge, the better this bracelet looks. So I'm going to be making a small bracelet today, so I'm using 21 inches of 14 gauge wire, just as specified in the written tutorial. And then I'm going to measure out 10 inches and I'm going to mark my wire at that 10-inch mark. Now, we're not going to mark this in the center. We want just a little bit of an offset because we're going to need just a little bit more wire to form one of the waves than we will the other. Now, once you have your mark, go ahead and grab your flat nose pliers, and we're just going to fold this wire at that mark. So grasp with the tip of your flat nose pliers, use your thumb to bend that wire down. Now when you're folding wire, you always want to work from both sides of the fold. And what this does is it gives you a cleaner fold and you don't end up with one side that's sort of bent crookedly. So we're just going to work that fold shut from one side to the other. Get that nice and tight. And then once you've got your fold pretty tight, go ahead and grab with your flat nose pliers and squeeze that fold shut, just like that. So this is going to become the hook part of our bracelet, and then the waves themselves are actually going to form the loop. Now once you get your wire folded, just kind of straighten it out a little bit. Try to get everything so that your wires aren't crossed like mine are right now. So I want to, kind of, if you can't get them super straight, then at least get them to where they're not crossing. And don't worry about it if they're not straight. That's going to be something that we're going to take care of as we continue to work this wire. And of course, when we weave it, that's going to straighten out any issues you have there. So that's part of the purpose of the weave, is to just add in some stability and also to add some texture. So now that we folded our wire, we want to go ahead and mark the points, sort of the critical points that we're going to use to shape this wire. So I'm going to make a mark a 1/2 inch from that folded end, and this is going to be the portion of the wire that I use to form my hook. So just make a mark 1/2 inch there, and then Let me get my wires a little bit straighter here. Part of the challenge of working with heavier gauge wire is it is just a little bit harder to work with. It's not as easy to rein in and get to lay flat as a lighter gauge. But the beauty of working with a heavy gauge wire is you can make some really beautiful sculptural pieces. And that's what's so special about this bracelet. It's those sculpted waves that make it really fun and unique. And it's just so nice to be able to create a piece of jewelry with essentially 2 pieces of wire. You know, we're going to use one piece of core wire and then ideally 1 long piece of weaving wire. Okay, so now that I've got that sort of straightened out and kind of wrangled, I'm going to measure 7 inches. I'm going to make a 7-inch bracelet. This is a small bracelet. Now again, if you want to make a different size bracelet, all of the information that you need to do that, you're going to find that in the project starter guide. That's a free download. I wanted to make all of that information available for free so that anybody can make this bracelet. There is a more detailed discussion about sizing and scaling in the written tutorial, of course, but there's enough information in that free tutorial that you can size your bracelet exactly the way you want it. So there we go. We've got our marks. I've got 7 inches between this point, which is going to be the edge of my hook, and this point, which is where we're going to begin forming our waves. And the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to flatten this fold and start forming our hook. So we're going to just sort of paddle this end here. We're not going to hammer beyond this 1/2 inch mark. That's why we made that mark. So we're just going to hammer from this point to the end. We'll paddle that a bit, and then we're going to shape it into a nice pointed hook. So to do that, I'm going to grab my bench block. So again, if you're new here, this is a 2.5 inch bench block and it's in a rubber base. I'm an apartment dweller, so I try to minimize noise as much as I possibly can. And I find that the best way to do that is to hammer on my nice solid thigh, which really helps deaden sound. If I hammer up here on my workbench, this is a hollow core surface and it's sort of like beating on a drum, and I just don't want to disturb my neighbors if I can avoid it. So that's why I'm sort of in this awkward position here. Don't feel like you need to do this, but if you're an apartment dweller and you want to minimize noise, this is a great way to do it. And of course, you can always find links to this bench block in the project resource guide, which is on my blog. Go to door44studios.com/106 and you'll find shoppable links there. And this bench block, which I love, is included there. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and just paddle this end gently. So we're just going to begin flattening, drawing that end out a bit. I want to flatten it enough that I can trim it and shape it into a nice, pretty, symmetrically shaped point. And notice as I do that, my wire is spreading just a little bit. That's perfectly normal. We're just going to press that closed with our flat nose pliers, and then we'll go ahead and shape this point. And that looks pretty good. It's pretty evenly flattened, but of course it did spread a bit, and that's normal. Wire will do that. It sort of has a mind of its own, so we're just going to squeeze that closed. And this is you're probably going to make some tool marks when you're doing this, so just sort of gently squeeze that closed as much as you can. And I did mark up the ends there, so we're going to have some tool marks that we're going to have to work out, but that's a big part of this first part of the process. We're going to do all of the sanding and shaping and cleaning up of our wire, and we're just going to end up with a really beautiful finished bracelet frame that we can just weave and shape. All right, now that you have that done, I'm going to go ahead and mark some lines here. I just want to draw myself some simple guidelines to help me visualize this as a point. So you see how I did that? I just used my permanent marker to add in some marks, and that's not perfect, but I'm just basically marking some guides there for where I'm going to trim this wire. Now, a note about wire cutters. When you're using heavy gauge wire, most jewelry wire cutters are designed to cut a certain gauge of wire. And my Swanstrom cutters here, they'll actually cut up to 14 gauge wire, but I rarely, in fact, I don't think I've ever cut 14 gauge wire with these cutters because I want to keep them in really good shape. These are an expensive tool, and I just want to maintain them as well as I possibly can and get as much life out of them as I can. So for wire that's 14 gauge and up, I have this old beat up pair of side cutters that I used to use when I worked as a mechanic. These are designed for electrical work, heavy duty electrical work. And you can see they have a sharp bevel here, so you're not going to get a clean flush cut, but because we're going to be doing a lot of finishing with files and sanding sticks here, I'm not concerned so much about a flush cut. So I'm going to use these pliers to trim off those edges that I want to get rid of. And by using these heavy duty pliers, I'm just saving my good tools, which I want to use for smaller gauges. So it's a good idea if you make jewelry, and especially if you work with a lot of heavier gauges, to go ahead and get yourself a nice heavy duty pair of wire cutters, side cutters. You can buy these anywhere. These are Craftsman tools. I've had them forever. But you can, pick them up at your local hardware store. This is just a standard tool that you would find in a typical hardware store, and it's designed for heavy duty electrical wiring. But in this case, it works beautifully for cutting our nice heavy gauge wire. And this is also what I used to cut this wire from the spool. I didn't show you that earlier because I already had this wire pre-cut. And then the next thing we're going to do is we're just going to refine that nice pretty bevel that we cut there with our needle file. So just file your edges smooth. Now you don't want to get too close to that bend. We want to make sure we have enough wire there that this doesn't break. So keep that in mind when you're trimming. Don't get too close to the inside of your fold, or that will leave you with too little wire there and your hook could potentially break down the road. But the way this bracelet is designed, the way it's made, the way it's bound with weaving wire, it's going to be pretty darn stable. I don't anticipate that you'll have any problems with it breaking. If you do have a problem, please let me know. I'd love to hear about that. I've never had one break on me, but I haven't. This is a relatively new design. This is not one that's been tested for years and years like a lot of my other designs. So if you run into any problems with it, by all means, let me know. I got some pretty deep tool marks there with my flat nose pliers when I was forming this, so I'm just going to kind of smooth those out just a little bit. You're not going to get anything super smooth with a needle file. It's better to just take out the really rough marks if you can, and then we'll get in there with sanding sticks and sandpaper to really clean that up. So that looks pretty good, and I'm going to round off this point just a little bit. I don't want a super sharp point because I just don't want anything that's going to catch on skin or clothing and snag on stuff. So I always sort of round mine off a little bit. I don't want super sharp corners, but I do like having a little bit of shape here because it looks so nice on the finished piece. The hook is somewhat visible on the front of the bracelet, so we just want that to look nice. And this is that 12 gauge piece that I just made, and then here's my 14 gauge piece, and you can see this one's been worn quite a bit, and it's just really sort of softened and taken on a nice soft patina and soft edges. And this piece is a little bit newer. It hasn't been tumbled yet. It'll soften up as I start wearing this, and this I suspect is going to be a piece that I wear frequently, it's probably going to become a daily wear for me because I just really love the weight of this bracelet. Just finish off smoothing your corners there. Kind of file the edges, just get them a little bit rounded. We're going to soften those more with sandpaper and sanding sticks, of course, but get everything sort of nice and smooth. Make sure you like the lines of it, and then we'll move on to the next step. So the next thing we're going to do is go ahead and start forming our hook. Now I'm going to use the 3mm step on my stepped bail making pliers. That's the second to smallest step. And I'm just going to grab right on the tip of that wire, get as close to the tip as you can, and you just want to make a little bit of a bend, just the slightest curve. Can you see that? And then once that's done, we're going to position that curve on our 6mm step, which is the middle step right here, the larger one, and we're going to bend the hook around this 4mm step right here. So I want that curve facing the 6mm step and just kind of laying gently against that. And then I'm just going to go ahead and start bending this hook around the 4mm step. And you want to go about 3/4 of the way around. You see that? You want this to be, this gap here between the hook and the core wires, to be big enough that you can slide your 14 gauge core wires into that gap, but you don't want it so big that it just looks open. So your hook should end up looking something like that. See that? A little bit of a shepherd hook kind of look to it. So there's our hook. Easy peasy, right? Now the next thing we're going to do is we're going to start forming our waves. But the first thing you got to do is make sure that you pay attention to which face you're working on. So we want our hook facing up. So as you can see on this bracelet, the hook faces up and out. So we're going to fold or we're going to start forming our waves, but we want to make sure we're working from the front face of our bracelet. So this is my front face here with my hook facing up. Now your wires may not want to lay completely flat here, and that's okay. You just want to make sure that you are aware of where this hook is. So now at this point, I'm going to take this longer wire and I'm just going to use my finger right here. I want to put my finger right about where that bend is, and I'm going to start bending this wire up and around. See how I'm doing that? I'm using my finger to kind of hold that bend, and you can even, bend around your finger. You want about a finger's width here. That loop needs to be about that thick. So we're going to bring this all the way around and down, just like that. See how I did that? Now the easiest way to do this is to press your wire on your work surface, and you're going to bring this wire, kind of hold everything tight together, and you just want to form that wire around the outside of that other bend, and we're just going to follow the shape of this wire. Now if you find that you don't have quite enough, just make this wire bend a little bit more. And we're just going to follow the shape of that first curve until our bend looks something like that. Got it? Now notice here our hook is in the front and this is our loops. And don't worry about this gap here. We're going to fix that when we weave it. So now that we've determined where our loop is going to cross over our bracelet band, we want to put just a little bit of a bend right there at that junction point. And what that's going to do is it's going to help center your loop just a little bit on your bracelet. And it's also going to give the bracelet just a little bit of more interest and dimension. It's going to flow a little bit better. So you can see here, there's this nice soft curve coming down and around. And then the waves just curl back over that. So it's just a nice, pretty, softly flowing curve. And then when you wear the bracelet, the hook is in line with the band over on the other side. Okay. Now that we've worked those ends together, we've got our loop formed. Now we're going to start forming our waves. So this shorter wire is going to become our tightly curled wave, this inside one right here. And then the longer wire is going to form our sort of little splash right back here. So I'm using my chain nose pliers for this. You can use your round nose pliers. I think I specified round nose pliers in the tutorial, but the fact of the matter is that we're going to end up trimming this piece off because we're going to inevitably create some tool marks while we form this sharp curve. So you want to grab the short tip of your wire with your chain nose or your round nose pliers and grab on tight, because 14 gauge wire is no joke to shape. It's stiff wire. It's going to be a little bit difficult to get that curve in there, but just form a nice little loop, something just like that. And now for your wave, just hold your two wires tight together, and we're going to bend this wire up and around that first curl, like that. And now I'm just going to use my thumb, and I'm going to bend this back down in the other direction. And you can make this wave as soft or as tight as you like. No two waves are going to look alike. That's the beauty of this design. It's going to be completely unique to you. And unless you use mandrels to form these waves, there's no chance of being able to duplicate these bracelets exactly from one to the next. All right, so there are our waves. Isn't that pretty? And now all that's left to do is we're going to trim off the excess wire. So like I said, on this one here, let's see if we can see in there. You can see some tool marks right there. We're just going to trim off a little bit of that. I don't want to trim too much because I want this wave to be pretty tight, but I'm going to trim off a bit of that end. You can see there, I still have a nice tight wave, but I think I got to just about where those tool marks were, so I shouldn't have any tool marks left there. And then on this one, we're going to trim it just about there. Like I said, no two bracelets are going to be alike. You just want a little bit of a splash there. Sort of looks a little bit like a whale's tail. And those are our waves. Easy peasy, right? Like this bracelet. I love the simplicity. Anytime I can make a piece of jewelry with a single piece of core wire, that's a win for me. I just think it's the coolest thing to take one piece of wire and make a really beautiful piece of jewelry with it. All right, now the next thing we're going to do is we are going to hammer both of these waves. We want to flatten them out a little bit. We're going to create some dimension here. So we want them to spread out a bit. So we're going to paddle this end. We're going to flatten this end out, and then we'll trim it later to get that nice sharp point on the wave. And this one here, I just love the way this turned out. Again, with 12 gauge wire, because you have more material to work with. Look how nice and fat those waves are. I just love that extra dimension that you get with a heavier wire gauge. I just think it looks beautiful. And it's so soft and it just feels sculpted. Even though this is nice, heavy, stiff wire, it almost looks like molten metal. It looks like it'll just move. So in order to flatten these wires, what we're going to want to do is we want to open up our loop, but make sure that, we're going to open this like we would a jump ring. So you're always going to twist open this direction. We're just moving those straight up. You see how I did that? I don't want to pull out because that will misform this curve right here. So in order to maintain the original lines, we just want to move straight back, just like that. And now I can lay these wires flat on my bench block and hammer them, which is exactly what I want. Now notice also what this does is it creates a situation where I'm going to be hammering on the inside of my curves. And what that does is when we fold these back into place, these sides are going to be nice and flat. They're going to have very little, if any, tool marks on them. And it's just going to be easier to clean up and sand and finish as we get to the next step. So again, this is super important. I talked about this a lot in my fleur-de-lis earring make along. If you haven't already made those earrings, make sure to go check that series out. It's a free series. You can even download the written tutorial for free in that case. And I talk a lot about finishing in that tutorial just to give you some insight on how you sort of strategically plan your hammering and your sanding and your finishing so that one, you save yourself time, and two, you just end up with a much more refined piece in the end. So now that we've got these ready to hammer, I'm going to go ahead and reposition my bench block again, and we'll get going with the hammering. Okay, I've got my bench block set up, and I'm ready to start hammering. Now, we really only want to hammer just this end. We don't want to get too far into this curve here. So really just this curve right here is the one that we really want to focus on. So I'm going to concentrate on the tip of that wire, and I'm going to just paddle it and draw it out to try to sort of round off that tip and get a nice, pretty, thick dimensional end that I can form into a really soft, pretty wave. See how I did that? And then I'm going to go ahead and bend that back into place so that I can get to my other core wire. And on this one, of course, we just want to hammer this curl. We don't want to get any further back into that wire. And I'm going to draw this out. I want a nice thick wave there. See how I did that? See how nice and thick that is now? And then when I draw this one back, bend it back into place, and there you can see on the front we have almost no tool marks. It's nice and flat and clean, and it's not going to take a lot of effort to clean that up with sandpaper. But first we're going to trim this end and get that nice sharp point that we want there on our curl. Okay, the next thing we need to do is just trim our curl. We want to shape that wave into that nice point that we're after. So I'm just gonna draw, see that point there? Sort of a square edge. I'm just going to come around this edge. That's what I want to trim off. So again, this just gives me a guide so that I can see exactly what I want to trim, and it gives me a sense of what this curl is going to look like once it is trimmed and filed. And then again, I'm going to use my heavy duty cutters for this, and I'm going to get right in there on that line so that I'm just trimming that corner back. So that's what that looks like. And obviously that's not a very pretty line. It's square, it's very sharp. It's got this, bevel on it. That's not what we want. So we're going to clean that up with our needle file. And to do this, anytime you're working on any kind of curve like this, again, you just want to twist it up. You don't want to bend it in the line of the curve because that'll distort your finished curve. But if you just twist it up and out of the way, what that does is now we can get in there with our file and without marring those wires there. So now that I've done that, I'm just going to knock off that bevel, and I'm going to soften this curve right here above the trimmed part. I want to make that line flow so that I am shaping this wire. I'm going to, take off a little bit of that point. I don't want it to be too sharp. So we want to soften that point, round it off. Remember, these are waves, so we want soft curves. We don't want any sharp lines here at all. And I'm just going to take off that top line until it flows nicely with the curve. And this just takes time and practice. Don't feel like you have to get it perfect the first time out. You'll have opportunities to come back and reshape this if you need to, and also you'll be able to do a little bit of shaping with your sanding sticks or your sandpaper. So with a file, we're just taking off, we're taking off quite a bit of metal. I want to take off that bevel, the chisel point that our wire cutters left, and I want to soften that point. And I'm just going to clean up the back, clean up any burrs that you see or feel there. And then we're just going to press that right back into line, and notice that it doesn't distort our curve at all. We're left with this nice, soft, round wave. And then I'm just going to touch up the end of this wave a little bit too, so I'm going to bend that right back out a little bit, twist it out, and I'll just soften this nice round curve here too. And remember, when you're using your needle files, you only want to go in one direction. Don't saw back and forth. Your needle files are cut in such a way that the teeth only work in one direction. So sawing back and forth doesn't do any good. It'll just clog up your file and it'll just create more work for you. But that backward draw doesn't pull any material off, so you're just wasting energy there. So there we go. Got that softened up a little bit. Looks like there's a little bit of a point here on the inside. I think I might be able to get that cleaned off a bit better with my sanding sticks, so I'm not going to worry too much about that. That's a little bit better. But like I say, you don't have to get super detailed with your needle file. Your needle file is for rough cuts and rough shaping, and then we're going to refine with sandpaper and sanding sticks. So that's what our loop looks like so far. This is what our hook looks like. And notice we've still got those marks there from the file and we had some pretty heavy tool marks there that I put with my flat nose pliers when I pressed this fold closed. That's normal. So that completes most of the forming that's going to happen on this bracelet. All that's left to do now for today is we're going to go ahead and sand and polish these waves and our hook and just make sure everything's nice and clean and we've gotten rid of all the tool marks. And then next week we'll go ahead and finish this piece. We're going to weave the two core wires together and finish forming the bracelet into its final shape. Now, I like to use these sanding sticks from Rio Grande. They come in a pack of 6 and they range from 400 grit to 3000. So these do a great job of, the 400 and 800 grit I use to remove tool marks and to finish doing any final shaping. And then from 1200 up, I just use those to progressively polish and finish my pieces. The 3000 grit will bring them almost to a mirror-like shine. Now, if you don't have sanding sticks or you don't want to use sanding sticks, I know not everybody wants to buy from Rio Grande because the shipping is quite expensive. As an alternative, you can use sandpaper, and I use 3 grits of sandpaper. I use 800, 1500, and 2000 grit, and that's plenty. 2000 grit will give you a nice finish on wire jewelry. And this is wet or dry sandpaper. It's designed for the automotive industry, so it's great for metal. And so we're going to go ahead and get started polishing and finishing this bracelet frame. But first I want to just take a quick peek and make sure that our frame is the proper length. So remember, I'm making a small bracelet that needs to be 7 inches. And as you can see here, this is going to be, well, it's actually a little bit long. It's about 7 1/4 inches. And that happens sometimes. You can go ahead, if you want to adjust your size, you can go ahead and adjust these lines a little bit. You can kind of stretch some things out. You can make things smaller or slightly longer. You know, if you need to make it a little bit longer, you can tighten this bend down here and you'll gain a little bit of length that way. But in this case, a 7¼ inch bracelet is going to be okay. That's not even quite 7¼ inches. So this is almost 7 inches. And bracelet sizing, again, is a little bit tricky to master bracelet sizing. But the beautiful thing about making your own jewelry is you can make custom sized bracelets. Most bracelets, of course, that are sold commercially are in standard sizes, and I don't know about you, but I find that they're usually too big for me. I have a hard time finding commercial bracelets that actually fit me very well. So since I already have my sandpaper out and it's right here in front of me, I'm just going to go ahead and use sandpaper to start this process. And I'm just going to put my finger here between the wave and the frame because I don't want to scratch up the frame with sandpaper, but I do want to polish up this wave. So I'm just going to get in here and start sanding lightly. Now the thing with sandpaper, you can go back and forth, you can go in circles. Sandpaper, unlike files, doesn't have a specific grain to it. So you can go ahead and sand in different directions and get a nice finish. Now the goal with this 800 grit paper, we want to do a couple of things. First, we want to round off the edges of our wave. I just want to soften those a bit, get them nice and smooth, a little bit rounded, and that's going to give these waves a little bit of dimension and some movement. So those nice round edges, you know, they will reflect light, and it just makes your bracelet look much more alive and beautiful. So you can see there, I've got a pretty even finish here on this. You can see it's sort of a matte finish. And I may do a little bit more sanding here. I want basically a matte, sort of a brushed metal look is what I'm going for with this 800 grit. And this is one place where I like to use an old sunshine polishing cloth, as I'll just use that to kind of clean off any pieces that I'm sanding and make sure that everything is nice and clean and that I'm getting the right look that I'm after. So can you see now? You could see this piece that was hammered. There's a little bit of a tool mark there, as opposed to this piece that's, you know, we've started the sanding process and it's starting to look a little bit more finished. You can see the edges there are a little more rounded. We kind of broke those edges down a little bit, and there's a little bit of a sharp corner here, right here on this tail. So I'm just gonna get in there and sand that, smooth that off a little bit more. And don't worry too much if you scratch up your core wires here, because keep in mind that all of this is going to be wrapped. We're going to have wire weaving up to about where these curls meet the core wires. So this part won't be wrapped, but this part will be completely covered with weaving wire. So again, you don't have to be super careful about getting scratches on those core wires. You do want to protect your loop a little bit because you don't want to scratch it up. Okay, and then just feel around, make sure that everything's nice and smooth. You don't want any rough spots. If you do have some rough spots, now's the time where you can bend these back out a little bit and maybe get in there in the back and take off any burrs that you feel there. And again, you can sort of round these edges off as well. And that's just going to help make this bracelet smoother and definitely more comfortable to wear. You're not going to have anything that's going to catch on clothing or scratch skin. You'll just have these nice, soft, rounded, finished edges. So that is done with the first stage there. We got our 800 grit done. And now I'm going to do the same thing here on the curl. So again, just lightly sand, break down those edges, get some nice soft lines. And one of the reasons I like using sanding sticks for this is they are just a little bit easier to get in some of these tighter spaces. But sanding paper, you can always just fold it like I've done here and, you know, make it work for you. Don't try not to fight it, just make it do what you want it to do and focus it where you want to sand. Now you notice I've got a pretty deep tool mark here. I'm not quite sure how I got that nick there. You see that? Just a kind of a deep scratch right there. We're going to try and knock that out before we go any further, because I don't want that to come out in the finished piece. I'm having a hard time. Can you see how I'm getting a little bit of a bevel there? So I'm not able to focus my sanding paper exactly where I want it. So I'm going to go ahead and grab my 400 grit sanding stick. It's raining pretty hard outside my window, so if you hear some noise, that's what that is. It smells really good though, having the window open with rain outside. So this is the 400 sanding grit. This is the red one. And I'm just going to go lightly over that spot where that scratch is. I'm not using any pressure at all. I'm just barely touching this wire with this 400 grit stick. This piece curved a little bit on me, which is okay. I don't mind having a little bit of added dimension there, but it does make it a little bit trickier to sand and get nice smooth results. So I'm just going to gently go over this and get a nice even finish with this 400 grit sanding stick. And sometimes it does help to just go in one direction. It's not necessary with sanding sticks or sandpaper, but sometimes it's just a little bit easier to do that. Let's see here. We're at, okay. It looks like that scratch is gone. Can't see the scratch anymore. You can see some light tool marks. There's little, it's not quite level, this piece. It's not as flat because I did manage to, as I was bending this back and forth, I actually tipped the tip back a little bit. So there's a little bit of a, I don't know if you can see it from this angle. See how that's folded a little bit? There's a little bit of a bend there. So that's why I'm getting sort of an uneven finish. But again, that's totally okay. This is actually going to work to our advantage because it's going to give this piece even more dimension once we finish sanding here. So we're going to go ahead and work our way up. Now I'm going to switch to the 1500 grit sandpaper. And again, I'm going to start with my little splash tail here. Again, I'm not using a lot of pressure. I'm just letting the sandpaper do most of the work. I'm not pressing super hard, but I am making sure that I get around all those edges, soften those up. I want nice, soft, rounded edges on this. It's water. We want it to look organic. We don't want any sharp corners on anything. Now you can see here, just on the inner part of that corner, and this will happen as you hammer and you shape curves. Even though this was on the flat side of the bench block, it still ended up with just a little bit of a curve in there. So I'm having a little bit of a hard time getting an even finish there. Can you see where there's, right there in the middle, there's just a little bit of a rough spot there. So all this takes is time. You just got to work with it. Just kind of get your sandpaper in there as best you can to even out that finish. And that looks a little bit better. I think we got that taken care of. Okay, so now it's back to our curled wave here. We're going to do the same thing. Just polish that up. And the goal isn't, with every grit of paper, you're going to get a little bit more shine on your finish. But 1500 grit is still, it's not going to give it a high polish. You're still going to have a little bit of a sort of a matte look. You just want to make sure that you have an even finish at this point. That's what we're after, is just an even, consistent finish with no spots that are, either more matte or more shiny. And as you can see, this wire did move on me quite a bit. Mostly this is from when I tipped the wire out to file off that point. That's where that bend came from. And again, it's okay. I don't mind it. I actually want it to have a little bit of a sculpted look and a little bit of a three-dimensional look. So we just kind of have to work with it and keep sanding and smoothing until we get that nice even finish. And that's looking a little bit better. We've got a couple of spots here. There we go, that's looking pretty good. And you can see there's still just a little bit. See that little spot right in there on the inside of that curve? I'd like to get that evened out if I can. A little bit difficult to get in there. But this is kind of the fun thing about doing this stuff by hand. You can do all of this with a rotary tool, but I don't know. I kind of like the process of doing it by hand, and you know, being able to watch as things come together. Rotary tools save time, and they're great if you're in a production mindset, you know, if you're making jewelry for sale. I'm trying to get out of the jewelry sale business myself. I much prefer teaching over making and selling finished jewelry. So my goal for the end of this year is to just transition completely to teaching, and I'll be getting out of jewelry sales because frankly I don't have enough time to do both. So I've had to choose, and I've decided to choose teaching. And there we go. That's looking a little better. There's just a little bit of that left there, but I think we can get to that with the 2000 grit and the 3000 grit. So now I'm going to go ahead and move on up to 2000 grit paper. And we'll just keep at this until we get a nice finish on our waves. And then we'll turn around and we'll work on our hook a little bit. Okay, we've done 800 and 1500 grit sandpaper, and now I'm just going to hit this with some 2000 grit. And again, I'm not using a ton of pressure, I'm just sort of lightly sanding. The goal here is to get a nice, even, smooth finish. And it kind of helps to keep these pieces separated. Keep this other wave out of your way if you can. They kind of want to snap together, which is good because we want them to, but it's a little bit more challenging when you're doing this process and we want them separate. And that's looking pretty good. See how that really just sort of reflects the light there? Look at that nice rounded edge. That's what we want. It's just going to look so pretty when this is all done, and that wave is really going to stand out against the texture of the background weave behind it. And now you can see I'm starting to get a bit more of a polish, and see how that inner part of that wave still has a little bit of a rough spot. There's just a low spot there, and that's what that indicates. And so we just need to keep working until we get that polished evenly. And you can see that spot getting smaller and smaller, so that means I'm getting down in there. Slowly but surely, working our way in. You can see just the slightest hint of it now. And I think we're going to call that good. Now, something that will happen when you do have a low spot like that, what that's going to do is that's going to catch patina, because that has a rougher finish than the area surrounding it. You're going to get a little bit of patina down in there, and that's actually going to help give this even a little bit more of a sculptural dimension. It's going to add some low lights, which is not necessarily a bad thing. We just don't want too much of that, and we don't want too much of a difference in the finish where we have, you know, a really rough spot, sort of a little island of rough spot amidst, you know, a high polished finish. And that looks pretty good. This lighting is a little bit challenging because of the rain. It's sort of cloudy and overcast. I lost my natural light. So now I'm just going to go ahead and do the same thing on this curl. And again, the goal is to just get a nice even finish. We're not looking for a super high polish at this point, because we've got one more step to go. That 3000 grit is really going to add the final polish. But we want to see a nice, even, bright finish on this. And again, we've got a couple of low spots that are just sort of stubbornly hanging out there, just right below the surface of the sandpaper. And to get to those, just use a little bit more pressure. I'm just pressing with my thumb as I brush the sandpaper across there. And that's starting to get in there. That's one advantage of using the sandpaper over the sanding sticks. You've got a little bit more control. You use your fingers as pads and really get down into those low spots. Whereas with the sanding sticks, they're a little bit flexible. They're a foam core, so they do bend just a little bit and they have some give to them, but they don't quite get all the way down in there. That looks pretty good. See that? Just one little spot there. Now another thing you can try, if you have a pro polishing pad, you might be able to get in there with that and get that spot touched up. And a pro polish pad is going to give you, you know, much like the 3000 grit. That's probably about what this is 3000 grit. The abrasive that's embedded in these foam pads is probably in that range. And you can see there we've got pretty much a mirrored finish, and I don't see that low spot anymore. Maybe just the slightest hint of it. But look how pretty that is, and look how nice and smooth those edges are. That's what we want. I talked about these pro pads in my last video, or a couple videos back, I guess. The video where I talk about polishing, dry polishing my finished jewelry. So I use these pads. I do use them when I'm making jewelry, but mostly I use them to maintain finished jewelry. So my own personal jewelry and jewelry that I'm selling, just before it ships, I give it a nice final polish, touch up the shine, and I'll use one of these pro pads to do that, or I'll use a sunshine cloth, or sometimes a combination of both. And these are, you know, the polishing pad and the sunshine cloth, those are my primary products that I use to dry polish finished jewelry. All right, let's see what we got here. We're going to put these back in place. And look at that shine. Aren't those beautiful? And we can go ahead and touch up these wires too, where we got a little bit of, kind of brushed it with the sandpaper a bit, so we've got some very light scratches there, but we can just buff those out real quickly using this pro pad, and that just gives these wires a really beautiful finish. Now you can go ahead and smooth off your frame wires if you like, using this pad. It's not going to do any harm. We're going to go ahead and weave on that, so it's not super critical that it be finished to perfection, but never hurts, right? You can never pay too much attention to detail when you're finishing. This is where all the magic happens, and it's also where a lot of the mistakes happen. So you really want to take your time and, you know, put a lot of thought and effort into your finishing. Don't skimp on this step. I know sometimes we get to the end and we're anxious to finish a piece and just be done with it, but every minute that you spend working on these finishing details is just going to benefit your jewelry. Okay, our waves are looking really good. It's looking about, I'd say, we're 99% of the way there. I can still see a little bit where wouldn't hurt to do a little bit of touch up, but that's looking really good. So I'm going to go ahead and call that good for now, and we're going to go ahead and turn around and focus on this hook. Now remember, we had some spots here where we filed out some deep tool marks, and you can see that file left, some pretty strong scuff marks there. So again, I'm going to go back to my 800 grit sandpaper, and I'm just going to get in there and soften those edges. Now here you have to be a little bit more careful on the hook because we're not going to weave all of the hook. We're going to do some weaving. We're going to start our weave just inside of this hook here, but we're not going to come all the way back around the hook with the weave. So we don't want to scratch it up too bad. We don't want to leave any visible marks. So you can kind of get in there with your sandpaper on those edges. We just want to, again, we want to soften these edges. We want everything nice and round and soft, no sharp edges. Should never have any sharp edges on jewelry because, this stuff is worn. Even though this hook is facing up and away from the skin, it's still likely to catch on stuff. Bracelets take a lot of abuse. They catch on things and they rub against furniture, and so bracelets have to be pretty hard-wearing pieces. And we want to make sure that everything's smooth and that there's not going to be anything that snags clothing or fabrics or anything like that. And wherever you have those deep marks, you may have to get in there with something a little stronger than 800 grit. So it may not hurt if you don't have sanding sticks. It may not hurt to pick up some 400 or 600 grit sandpaper as well. And if you go to the project resource page on my blog, it's Store44Studios/106. If you go to that page, you'll find shopping links for all of the tools and materials and supplies that I use to make this bracelet. So I include sources for wire, multiple sources for everything where I can. So I've given you options of Etsy or Amazon or Rio Grande or wherever it is that I buy materials, and I always try to send you to the same stuff that I use. So for wire, for instance, I buy all of my wire almost exclusively at Rio Grande, and that's where I send you to buy wire. I also provide wires on Etsy if you want to buy in smaller quantities, and there are some good suppliers on Etsy. Go ahead and go to that page if you need help locating anything. If you've already got sources, great. Use the sources you love. But if you don't and you want to know where I buy my stuff, you'll have links to all of that information there. I feel like I've got a little bit of a scratch. Let's see, it's a pretty deep scratch. So I'm going to get in here with my 400 grit sanding stick, just because it's going to move things along a little bit faster if we just get in there and get that big tool mark out of there. All right, that looks a little better. I think I got those deep scratches out of there. And now we'll just go ahead and continue giving this a nice, good polishing finish. So starting with the 800 grit again, and you can see where I'm scratching down here on this core wire. That's okay. I'm gonna weave over that section of wire, and having a little bit of tooth there is not a bad thing because that's going to hold our weaving wire in place. So we'll just leave that alone. And again, I'm using almost no pressure here. I'm just very lightly sanding because I'm not trying to take material off so much as I'm just trying to smooth it. Okay, so we've got this hook looking pretty good. We got most of those deep scratches out. You can see there are just a few scratches right in here in the inner part of that curve. And that's going to be difficult to get to with my current sanding tools. I don't have a round sanding stick, which would be really useful to get in there right now. So that's something I'm going to have to look at coming up with a solution for that, for a, a good hand tool. But this is looking pretty good. So I'm going to go ahead and finish this up with some 1500 and 2000 grit sandpaper. And then our frame will be ready to weave. So again, I went from 800 and now I'm moving up to 1500, kind of moving toward that final finish. And I'm just getting in on the sides of the hook first. And then I'm going to really polish the top face of that hook because again, that's going to be visible in our finished bracelet. So we really want that to look nice. So I'm just going to go ahead and sort of bend my sandpaper into a nice sort of rounded edge there that I can get right on the face of that hook and get down where that hook curls there at the tip. We want to make sure we get rid of any tool marks there because that's going to be a visible bit. And again, I'm using very light pressure. I don't want to take material off. I just want to smooth and polish the surface. So keep that in mind when you're using sandpaper. It doesn't take a lot of pressure. Just very light pressure is going to give you just that nice surface finish that you're after without taking away a lot of material. And that's really important on this hook. We don't want to lose any material right there on that point because we don't want it to break or split. Now I'm switching to the 2000 grit paper. And again, this is really our final polish right here almost. So very light pressure. I'm not trying to take off any material, just trying to get a nice pretty finished polish. Let's see what we've got here. That's looking pretty good. I'm not going to spend too much more time on this. I think you get the picture. You just want to, any parts that are going to be exposed and visible, you just want to clean those up as best as you can. And of course, this is easier to do with power tools. A rotary tool would make much faster work of this. But again, I really sort of prefer to work with hand tools, and I just, a rotary tool is going to take up a lot of space on my very small workbench, and I don't have a dedicated studio space, so I just feel like, I can get carried away with tools, and it's just going to be difficult to maintain this space and keep it clean. It is in our bedroom after all, so that's why I prefer to work with hand tools. But of course, if you have the space and the inclination to buy a rotary tool, you can make much faster work of this and get a really beautiful finish on your bracelet frame. And just keep in mind that the reason we're doing this now is once we start weaving, or once we add weaving, I don't like to do a lot of polishing once I've added weaving wire because you risk damaging your weave. Weaving wire is very fine. It doesn't have there's not a lot of material there, so you can really kind of damage a weave if you do too much sanding and finishing, especially with, 400 grit, 800 grit, or a needle file, something like that, you're going to cause a lot of damage to your weave and potentially break your weaving wire, and that's no fun. So it's always best to do most of your finish work on your frames before you start adding in and weaving. All right, so there we go. Our hook is looking really good. Nice shine on it. Looks nicely finished. And then of course our waves look really beautiful as well. So that's it for today's tutorial. That includes part 1 of this series. You come back next week and we're going to go ahead and add in our weave, and we're going to finish up this bracelet and form it into its final bracelet shape. That's all for today, wire weavers. I hope you're enjoying this project so far. If you have questions about anything we've done today, go ahead and drop those in the comments below, or better yet, join my private Facebook group, Wire Weaving with Wendy. I'll be answering lots of questions there, and I'll also be sharing some exclusive video content that you won't be able to find anywhere else. To join today, go to Door44Studios/Wendy. And until next week, my friend, go make something beautiful.